Welcome back to Open Exchange. We've got a white collar crime theme day today, and in the studio with me in Cape Town. That's why I'm wearing a blue shirt, by the way. In the studio with me in Cape Town is Graham Dawes, Director for Forensics at Deloitte Risk Advisory, and also Stephen Powell is with us, who's Forensics Executive at ENS Forensics. Graham, Stephen, thanks very much for coming in. Graham, can I start with you? How big is white collar crime, first of all?
It's a massive phenomenon globally. I mean, if you look at the ACFE, the Association for Certified Fraud Examiners, they predict that an average of 5% of turnover of organisations is lost to white collar crime. So if you translate that into GDP numbers for South Africa, it's huge.
Stephen, sort of characterise a typical white collar forensic style crime.
The most common thing we find at the moment is electronic funds transfer fraud, where accountants, bookkeepers working for organisations are changing bank account details of vendors on the system and then diverting payments to themselves, to their spouses and boyfriends. And a lot of companies are not even aware that they've been targeted by this type of fraud. It's very difficult to detect, and they literally lose millions before they realise that they are actually out of pocket.
Is it quite easy to do? I mean, that's an easy sort of question to ask, but you've just said that accountants sitting at the desk can almost hack in and divert funds without detection.
It is. There are a number of controls, and usually you need 1 or 2 passwords to get into the system to change that type of detail. And ordinarily, most individuals that implement the electronic funds transfer payments don't have the right to change and amend banking details. But because people don't monitor and watch their passwords, it's very easy for those individuals to access diaries, desks, and find the information, or just go have a casual chat with their supervisor while the supervisor logs in. But corruption is also a big problem. Buyers getting kickbacks, that type of thing, it's really rampant in South Africa.
I would imagine, Graham, that hackers as well, people that are technically proficient in IT, keeping one step ahead of companies, can maybe get syndicates together and target people within organisations. That's probably where data forensics come in. How do you combat the sort of crime that Stephen was talking about?
It's a big part of it. So we put together a cyber incident response team for exactly that reason, is looking at cyber criminals that are targeting organisations across the globe. South Africa at the moment is probably the #1 across Africa in terms of internet hacking. So there was a report released a little while ago by Symantec which pitched South Africa at the highest levels of internet cyber crime. So it's a huge phenomenon. We see it as probably the most serious phenomenon going forward in terms of white collar crime. Because now you're not only dealing with South Africans and internal staff that might be stealing money, you're dealing with the globe. And it's an anonymous individual, some sitting somewhere possibly in the back of Russia.
Gangs, for example, syndicates.
Definitely. Syndicates operate globally. So, I mean, we've seen that in the States recently. I think the latest case was 160 million US that was stolen by a cyber criminal gang.
Stephen, give us an example of how ENS Forensics would tackle a crime. A company says, look, I think someone's filtering off a bit of money here. What do you actually do? Give us a step-by-step account.
Okay, Lindsay, the first step is actually a background check on the individual. We call it a lifestyle audit, where we look at the individual, we look at the suspicion or the concern, and we just try and make sure that the lifestyle is commensurate to the earnings that the client would pay the individual.
So if I come in with a Lamborghini, for example, tomorrow, then CNBC Africa are going to start to ask some questions.
Absolutely, and it's a lot less innocuous, a lot more innocuous. You don't have to have the Lamborghini, but often just a luxury car or 4x4 is the first symptom that the company will pick up. And they will ask us to do some background check-in. So before the individual even realizes that they're under investigation, the company will, via us, gather a lot of information. Once we've got enough information, then we start analyzing the role that the individual plays within the organization. What are the rights, authorities, what does the individual have access to, and where is the potential fraud? And then we do transaction-specific investigations. And one of the key things is cyber forensics. We will analyze the individual's computer, so the individual will think that there's some software being loaded on that PC. But what we will have done is imaged it completely, and then we start analyzing who is the individual talking to, what are they conspiring, and who are they connected to,
So it starts very basic with basic detective work and then gets more complicated after that. What about big data? How is that affecting the whole picture?
Big data is a thing of the future. So at the end of the day, every single bit of communication, if you look at it at the moment, is happening electronically. So the trick here is to be able to analyze masses of data to look for evidence. And that's your proficiency in that type of analytics will set you apart in investigating these type of offences. Because I mean, if you look at the moment, the stats are saying that data is probably doubling every 2 years in size. So your ability to be able to host that data and then do some form of analytics, probably predictive analytics is where we're going, to actually understand fraud before it happens.
Yeah.
So we generally play at the moment in the very reactive space and to some extent the proactive space. But the future in terms of big data is actually moving to predictive modelling in terms of fraud typologies.
Stephen, just very finally, are we ahead of the curve in South Africa, or are we playing catch up with the rest of the world? And if we are playing catch up, does that mean that we can expect to get more of these syndicates that we've spoken about targeting our companies?
We definitely playing catch up, and the biggest problem, Graham and I were just chatting prior to this show, Lindsay, the biggest problem in South Africa is limited resources. You know, we've got Deloitte as their forensics, ENS as our forensics unit, and a number of the audit firms have all established units. But there is just too much crime out there. There are too many syndicates, too many crooks, too many dishonest employees within organizations for us to reach out to. And the other difficulty is the lack of resources on the part of the state. The NPA, the investigative bodies are.
But is it a state Is it a state responsibility rather, or is it the responsibility, Graham, of the individual companies to set up their own forensics departments or outsource their forensics needs to companies like yours?
I mean, typically it's a responsibility that's borne by the state. So in most developed countries, a lot of that responsibility is borne by law enforcement agencies. I think in South Africa there is a significant lack of skills. You've had major movements out of law enforcement, and so a lot of that is now being outsourced to companies like ourselves, and we carry a lot of those skills in those firms.
Graham, we'll leave it there. It's Graham, Stephen, thanks very much for coming in. Graham Dawes is a Director of Forensics at Deloitte Risk and Advisory, and Stephen Powell, Forensics Executive at ENS Forensics.